Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin. In today's video, I'm going to show you some easy quilt blocks that work great for plaid. I recently did a video where I showed how to put plaid fabrics together with solids or other plaids, kind of to make a colorway that includes plaid fabrics. And if you, like me, are using shirt fabrics, maybe even you're making a memory quilt and you have a pile of shirts that include a lot of plaids and it's daunting, it's always good to have several good quilt patterns or quilt blocks that you can reliably use that work well with plaids. And you might have a lot of plaid shirt fabric, and finding patterns, quilt patterns that really highlight the shirts and work well can be challenging. And so working with plaids doesn't have to be hard, but starting with a good quilt block or a good quilt pattern is a great place. So first, I want to show you just the most basic and reliably good quilt block or quilt pattern for shirt fabrics. It's a 9-patch block. I'm a little bit, someone might accuse me of being obsessed with them. I'm in the process of making a 9-patch trip around the world quilt, and I have just discovered what a versatile and reliably good quilt pattern it is. It's great for every skill level, from the most beginner, the most novice, to the most experienced, most skilled quilters. Putting 9-patch blocks together, especially with plaid, it just works. Really all it is just alternating blocks of, and it's typically a print, or in this case a plaid, and then a solid background, and then they just alternate. So in this situation, I have a very, one might even call it garish, red Christmas plaid, and it has been really challenging to work with because there are so many colors and it's so vibrant. But when I broke it up in this 9-patch with white, suddenly you get to see what's delightful about that plaid. I have both styles, so the starting with plaid, and so plaid, solid plaid, and then vice versa. And then here's the one that would be next to it. So what you can see is, and you can turn that around, or you can turn it around again to try to match it up how you would like. You can see how none of the plaids are touching each other. So I'm not doing this. And so if these were two different plaids that were in a similar colorway, it would still work because I'm not matching up plaids next to each other. They're all separated by a white block. And because it's just squares, there's no trimming, there's no, you just sew the blocks together and then sew that row to this row and so on and so forth. So you could very easily make a whole big block of these 9-patch smaller blocks with this red fabric, and then let's say you have a navy one, you could do a whole big block of 9 patches with navy plaid. And if you were thoughtful in the way you arranged it in the final quilt, it could be really, really lovely. It's really a matter of doing it thoughtfully and artfully. So you do, for example, and I used this in my strip sewing video, I could make a number of these 9-patch blocks to have a much bigger block. And then let's say I have a gray plaid and then a blue plaid, and I could do that on a diagonal or across, just a big section and then another big section. And when I lay it out, I often lay it out on my bed so I can see how it looks. you can play with the arrangement of each individual 9-patch block and really get a sense of how it will look. And you're not committing to having plaids butting right up against each other. So that is an excellent starting place. A variation of this would be to do exactly this same thing, but instead of making 9-patch blocks, you just use every shirt fabric that you have, and you just either randomly or intentionally alternate them all across a whole quilt top. So plaid, white, plaid, white, plaid, white, and then vice versa, and make a checkerboard. I have made one of these actually, and it just is impressive, not because it's difficult to make, but because the sheer volume of fabrics and the delight that it kind of causes, the joy that's there of all of these disparate fabrics separated by white. It's just really, it'll kind of take you aback as you're enjoying using the quilt, because the fabrics are all different and all randomized across the quilt. It's like, oh, look at that. Oh, look at that. And if your if your plaid is kind of a complex plaid, if one square looks like this, for example, and one square looks like this, if they're 3 feet apart from each other in the quilt, it doesn't look like you made a mistake cutting your plaids. So that's a variation. It wouldn't be a 9-patch at that point, but it really is just a checkerboard. It's just plaid and then background fabric, plaid. And you can do your background fabric any color you want. So you could do all navy, all gray, all white, all cream, and based on whatever shirt fabrics you have. So that would be, to me, the easiest and maybe best starting place. So that's a start. Next up is, I don't actually know the name of this. I will be honest with you, I made this up. I cut 4 5-inch squares, and then I had some white fabric that I cut into what would be the equivalent of a jelly roll. So a 2.5-inch strip, and then I cut a 2.5 by 2.5-inch square for the cornerstone or for the center block, and sewed it together. I did a square, and then I had cut my 2.5-inch strip of white, the length of this block, and then sewed the next one to it, did that for the bottom, and then made that strip in the middle. And I think it's really lovely. My plaid is not actually perfectly aligned. You can kind of see some variation. To me, it's not really bothersome. It's the sort of thing that it just looks like plaids coming together in a block. And again, because they're separated, this is sashing, because it's separated by sashing, if these were up against each other, it would clash. And you know what? I think I actually said that the wrong way because the blue. But perfect example. If those were right next to each other, that would be visually jarring because probably this whole row should have been turned around the other way. But because it's separated by that white, I hope you can see that. I chose a navy with white polka dots in the center because of that navy stripe in the plaid. And you could do that. I can't take it. You could do a number of these blocks, and if there was a continuous color, so for example, if you have a lot of browns and blues, you could make your cornerstone one of the common, it's almost like the least common denominator and the greatest common factor. So you're trying to, do you remember that from elementary school math? And I always got them confused. But the idea there is what is common between your plaids you use as your cornerstone. So it might be gray, might be blue. You might not be able to find a common thread. And in that case, you could just do straight white sashing. And what ties the plaids together is the arrangement that you do them with in the final quilt top. So you could put these all on a diagonal. You could do them like this. Maybe the top row of the quilt is all this teal and blue. And then the next one is something that's blue. And then the next one is blue and gray, and the next is gray. All right, moving up the difficulty level just a little bit. So we're still working with squares and rectangles, but we're going to use some white triangles to make them not look like squares and rectangles. And if you've seen any of my other videos, you know I have used this block 100 million times from the eyelet lace quilt. But it's a perfect example of how to use a pattern that is not as simple as just squares. So it doesn't look like it's squares, and it has a very profound impact, but it's great for plaid, and I'll show you why. Here you see I've used gingham in the corner pieces. This is just a square with a white background square that's sewn right there. Let me do it right here. Here's a square, and then there's a white square that goes right here. It gets sewn across, folded back, well trimmed, and folded back and pressed. And so that lovely, just kind of, it's also called a snowball. So that's described as a snowball. It looks like it's complicated, but it's a square. So this is a wonderful style. If you find another quilt pattern or quilt block that has this snowball scenario, you can make it really work for you, because again, and this pattern in particular, it's all separated by, each of these is a block, so it's not actually sashing, but there's no place that the plaids converge together on the same seam. So I used a gingham in the center, I used a gingham on the corners, and I was able to just cut on the line of that gingham, and it stayed straight. And a lot of people have said, oh my goodness, how do you make your plaids stay so straight? I just cut on the line and it's a square. So this is a pattern, a quilt block, that looks like it's not squares or rectangles, but it really is. And I'm going to show you the blue. So exact same block, feels different because it's different colors, but you can see how in the same quilt, this will have a divider between it. It works. And I just wanted to take a moment, even though this is about plaids, and tell you that when you're using gingham, it can, I think a lot of people are scared to use it. A lot of times it feels like it's going to shift. But if you cut it square, it's going to work for you, and it's going to read just like a lighter version of the color. So it's going to read like a pastel. And that's just an aside that you didn't ask for. But any block that utilizes that snowball feature is also great for plaid. So this is an example of it, but there are 1,000 of them. And actually, kind of sneak peeky, my friend Jennifer and I are in the process of doing another experiment, this time with plaids and some quilt blocks. So stay tuned for that. I could have used a different plaid for the smaller petal. And again, because it's separated by that white in the block, it doesn't compete with what's around it. I've put the fabric out here because I want you to see it before I show you the block. But I'm going to hold the block up, and I'm not going to do anything. The editor is going to freeze frame, and I want you to take a few seconds and just take it in. Just take the block in, and then we're going to talk about it specifically. So I'm going to get that out and hold it up, and then we're going to talk about it. So here's the block. It's pretty, isn't it, this block? Let me put it down here where you can see it up close. The reason why I had my husband freeze frame and give you a few seconds to take it in, I wanted you to see, just kind of get your feel of it. My hunch is, I may be wrong, but my hunch is that you didn't see the block and go, wow, she did not cut those plaids straight at all. And the reality is, I did not cut these plaids straight at all. So here's the block. And this one is a little bit at the skill level, and just because it has half square triangles. So it has HSTs in it. what I did, I kind of made this block on the fly the other day. This block is part of a quilt pattern called Speckled by Robert Kaufman, and it is a free pattern. So if you like the way this looks, it's a free pattern. Google Speckled by Robert Kaufman. We'll put a link in the description below. This is one of those times where a viewer sent me a message in Instagram, and it was, about using shirts and how she had made this quilt pattern. It was right after I had made that first video on plaids, and we laughed because the timing was so great. And what she did, she had a whole bunch of shirts from a family member and essentially made a memory quilt. And she used this pattern, and the way she oriented, we'll show you a picture. It's gonna show up here. I think it's over here. The way she did it, she used each of her shirts, and when she put the whole quilt top together, she put all of the same shirt on a diagonal and then all of the next shirt on a diagonal. And so there's a colorway going like blue, gray, blue, red, blue, gray, and it is really, really pretty. She did a fantastic job. If you look at this closely, this one is wonky, this one is wonky. This little quadrant is pretty good. This one's pretty good. It starts getting a little messy over here too. This one's kind of crooked. This one's kind of crooked. And actually, I don't know why the two crookeds had to be next to each other. So even when I first put it together and just had this little quadrant, I thought, oh, that's pretty good. And then had each one. And then I put the sashing in between them and was like, oof, that's kind of crooked. And this one, same thing. I got the sashing on this one, and it felt a little crooked. And then I did this sashing strip across, which, by the way, let this be a lesson to us all. This is not lined up straight. Look at that. Do you see how that's off? It's off on this side too. But in the middle of a quilt, no one will know. No one will know. And if they know, they certainly won't say anything. And if they say something, these are not people you need in your life. Okay, maybe you need them, maybe they're family members and you need them in your life. Most everybody is not going to notice, especially once you get it quilted, because the quilting hides the piecing and the piecing hides the quilting. And the quilting enhances the piecing and the piecing enhances the quilting. It is the magic of quilting and what makes it so enjoyable and fun. Everything enriches the other, and if there are imperfections, which there will be imperfections, they're hidden by the work of the other part of the quilt. So I threw this together and was like, oh gosh, that's kind of crooked, and I'm going to talk about this on this video. And then I put the the border around it. It's not sashing if it's on the outside, but I put the border around it, and then all of a sudden I was like, oh, that looks great. And that's what will happen to you. So this one is a little more complex. It's still very easy. It's still very easy to make. And this particular pattern, that Speckled by Robert Kaufman, is really easy to follow. So you just make your HSTs and turn them in such a way that it looks like an open envelope, and sew them with your sashing, and ta-da! So there's squares and half square triangles. Half square triangles and plaids, they are both easier than they look and harder than they look. If you're really, really worried about it matching up, it's going to be frustrating. But if you can let it go and make your whole block like this, super easy. Made this in just no time flat. And I'm not a fast sewer. And I'm not one of those people who's been sewing so long that they don't have to think about it. I have to think about it. And it came together in a relatively short period of time. And it was fun to make and easy to make. So this one would be an excellent choice if you want something that's a little bit more complicated than just squares sewn together and has a little more interest, but you can still use a whole variety of plaids in the same quilt, and it will be beautiful because it's got that white on the center and white around the outside, and so it breaks it all up, and you would never notice if you didn't get your plaids lined up perfectly. So we'll end with that. There are, again, so many patterns out there that work for plaids. The navy blocks that are behind me is a pattern called Quilty Stars by a designer that goes by Quilty Love. And I have put plaids in the square around the center square, and it works for me. Now, it's tricky sometimes getting plaids up against each other. So that would not be, I wouldn't call that easy. It's just one of those things. It's how precise you want to be and how worried you are about it. So the ones that I've chosen to highlight for you are ones that have kind of foolproof design features that protect you from having those plaids together that might make it not as lovely or not as easy. So I hope this has been helpful for you. If you know of a good quilt block that works great for plaids, I would love for you to put it in the comments or link it or whatever. Any resources that you think would be helpful for other quilters who are wanting to use plaids, always welcome the suggestions. I'm Kathy Martin. This is the Catbird Quilts. Thank you so much for watching.